Good morning. Здравствуйте все и доброе утро. I'm Tyler Combs, a senior studying political science and Russian and East European studies. I'm also president of the Civil Society at Indiana University, a nonpartisan civic engagement organization, and a foreign language and area studies fellow. Unlike many of my colleagues here at the Hamilton Luger School, I didn't come into college planning to study a critical language or international affairs. Though I was interested in foreign policy, I was determined to study American politics, go to law school, and practice constitutional law, because clearly I like fields that are easy to break into. But after some amazing courses in international relations, a few influential professors, and following the drama of election meddling on the 24-hour news cycle, I found myself focusing my political science major on international relations and studying Russian language. Thanks to the range of opportunities provided here at HLS, and far, far more trial and error than I would care to admit, I discovered that international relations and the study of the post-Soviet space are my passions. Now, I want to put the amazing education I've received at this university to good use through a career in international policymaking with the United States government, because foreign policy is the only field I can think of more competitive to break into than constitutional law. It is my privilege to introduce today's panel on presidential elections and U.S. foreign policy. Whit Ayres is a leading political consultant with over 30 years of experience in polling and survey research for high-profile political campaigns and associations. He is the author of 2016 and Beyond, How Republicans Can Elect a President in the New America. Geoffrey Garin is president of Hart Research. His clients include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, Harvard University, and the College Board. In 2012, he served as the pollster and strategic advisor to Priorities USA. Allison Stanger is the Russell Lang Class of 1960 professor of international politics and economics at Middlebury College. She's the author of Whistleblowers, Honesty in America from Washington to Trump, and One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy. Stanger's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. Bill Whitaker is a correspondent at CBS 60 Minutes. He has worked for CBS Evening News and CBS Sunday Morning, and as CBS News' Tokyo correspondent. Whitaker has received many awards, including Emmy, DuPont, and Peabody Awards. Our moderator, Marie Harf, is a national security and communications and policy strategist who has worked on critical issues, including the Iran nuclear negotiations and the Syrian refugee crisis. She is currently the executive director of the Serve America PAC and is also a Fox News Channel analyst, providing national security and political on-air analysis across FNC and Fox Business Network's daytime and primetime programming. She is also a member of the Hamilton Luger School's Dean's Advisory Council. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. We are like any good Hoosiers. We've covered all our bases. We have a Republican and a Democratic pollster, an academic, and a journalist to talk about the election. So we are coming at this from all angles today. And I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here, especially the students. I'm a 2003 graduate, so that feels like a lifetime ago. But thank you all for coming today. Our topic is foreign policy in the presidential election, and there's often this conventional wisdom among the punditry class that voters don't care about what happens overseas, that they care about the economy and they care about healthcare and domestic issues, but when you dig a little deeper, the picture's more complicated. Often voters use what they call a commander-in-chief test to see if they can envision a candidate with their finger on the nuclear button. They use it as a stand-in for leadership and judgment. And of course, when a crisis like the coronavirus hits, foreign policy comes into elections for voters in a way that sometimes it does not. So we're going to dig into these issues today, and I have a couple questions we're going to start with on the panel, and then we're going to come to you, so start thinking about your questions as well. So Whit, I'm going to start with you. We talked a little bit earlier this week about the big picture question that we're looking at today. What do Americans see as the biggest threats facing the United States today, and how is that playing into this presidential cycle? You obviously look at data and the polling a lot on these kinds of issues.
Well, thank you, Marie. And first of all, let me say what a privilege it is to be here at the Hamilton Lugar School. I have admired Chairman Hamilton for many years from afar, and I had an opportunity to work with Senator Lugar some decades ago when I was an American Political Science Association fellow assigned to his office. I came to know him as a man of enormous ability, enormous influence. At the time, he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but also a man of enormous integrity and decency. Both of these men are great examples for us that you can be incredibly successful in American politics and maintain your integrity and treat everyone with respect. So all of you should be pleased to have the names of Hamilton and Lugar on your resumes the rest of your life.
I'm going to clap for that.
Foreign policy doesn't matter in American politics, except when it does. In the lifetimes of some of the people in this room, we can remember numerous instances where foreign policy was determinative. In 1968, it caused President Johnson not to run for re-election. In 1979, the Iranian hostage crisis really undermined Jimmy Carter and helped President Reagan win election. In 2002, the 9/11 crisis helped the Republicans keep control of Congress, and in 2004, helped George Bush get reelected. And in 2006, fear and disgust and frustration with the Iraq War caused the Democrats to take control of Congress. So there are many instances where foreign policy has had a substantial effect when it starts affecting Americans personally. What are most Americans worried about in foreign policy? It's a whole subset of issues around the concept of security. Security personally from terrorism, security for our jobs, economic security, and now security for our health from the coronavirus and global pandemics. There are less important issues like human rights abroad, developing democracy abroad, helping second world countries strengthen themselves economically. They're less important to the American public, which is why you need, if you want those to be important, you need to tie them back to one of the issues they care about, one of the security issues. Great example is PEPFAR, the program for George W. Bush, the anti-AIDS, anti-malarial initiative in Southern Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. I went to Tanzania, I went to Kenya with the One campaign and saw what an incredible effect a little bit of money, I mean, Mike Bloomberg pocket change, had in Africa. And because of that, America's favorable rating is higher in Sub-Saharan Africa than anywhere else in the world. That helps protect our security because Islamic terrorists will have a hard time getting a foothold. So if you want to make issues like humanitarian aid and developing democracies important, tie them back into making America more secure economically, more secure from terrorism, or more secure for our health.
Jeff, I'm going to go to you with a version of the same question because I agree with Whit. You know, I've spent a lot of my career trying to figure out when and how Americans care about foreign policy and trying to get them to care more. But it's hard, and trying to make those ties back to why it impacts them, whether that's food security that like Dick Lugar worked on so much, or other issues, nuclear nonproliferation. These are tough challenges to get voters to care about. So how do you see it playing out in this current election cycle?
Well, in a couple of ways, really. I think, you know, the level of interest and attention to foreign policy issues really is driven by what people are seeing and hearing in the news, by real-world events. So that, you know, even at a moment where you know, voters' inclination is to be inward-looking and to think we need to take care of our problems here at home, things happen in the world that draw voters' attention. Coronavirus is one example, but it's not the only example. We've had the, you know, people paid attention momentarily, but paid attention when President Trump withdrew our troops from Syria and abandoned the Kurds. It was a moment actually where his approval ratings went down. They didn't stay down as a result of that, but people thought that that was important, both because it reflected on the protecting Americans from terrorism and also President Trump's own leadership qualities that I want to talk about as well. They pay attention based on political party to different things.
So give some examples of that.
Well, the biggest example is climate change and the climate change crisis. So that, we work for an organization called National Security Action, which is in some ways the Obama Alumni Administration, the Obama Administration Alumni Club. But, we did a survey about what the foreign policy and national security priorities ought to be. And terrorism is at the top of the list for everybody, as Whit suggested. But addressing global challenges like climate change is right up at the top for Democratic voters, for younger voters, and for Republican voters, it is way at the bottom. So that there's one group of voters who see it's vitally important for the United States to be engaged globally in addressing challenges like climate change, and another group of voters for whom that's anathema. And where
do independents fall in that?
Kind of in between, really.
Which would make sense, yes.
I mean, it's not.
I knew the answer to my own question.
There are some issues where independents are kind of lean more toward Democrats, and others where they lean more to Republicans. But this is one where it really depends what kind of independent you are. Right. Are you old or young? Are you there are other things that tend to drive that. So to me, the kind of the drivers of what are people seeing in the news that impinge on that. And the other thing is, I think there are two real standards here. Is how does it affect me personally? And Whit did a brilliant job in outlining that. And secondarily, it is, what are we doing on behalf of our national interests? And as a public opinion researcher, what is really interesting is the changing nature of how people define what our national interests are. And that, that really does move from time to time. Again, I think there are kind of very big differences between better educated and less well-educated voters about how they see our national interests. And just having not a question of whether something is a priority, but should we do it or not do it, is driven by how people see it relating to our national interest. Yeah. And this idea of our national interest is very much in flux, and really, I think, a big key to understanding a lot of what's going on politically.
If I could just make one quick addition to what Jeff said. There's a bizarre pattern going on now with President Trump and the polarization in American politics. If President Trump says an issue is important, the percentage of Republicans who think it's important goes up, and the percentage of Democrats who think it's important goes down. So since Donald Trump came down that escalator in June of 2015, the percentage of Republicans who think illegal immigration is an important issue has gone way up, but the percentage of Democrats who think it's an important issue has gone way down, and that applies across a whole range of issues.
And immigration, of course, in many ways is also a foreign policy issue. Allison, I want to pick up with you on something that Jeff said, because you've done great work on whistleblowers, and by the way, you can buy her book out front called Whistleblowers. You should do that. I will plug for her. But one thing, you've done a lot of work on whistleblowers, also on government surveillance, and in terms of this changing nature of the national interest, after 9/11, there was a broad, I think, bipartisan agreement that we needed, I don't know, better, more surveillance to try and prevent something like that from happening again. And then it became sort of more of a conservative issue. But now, after 2016, it feels like a script has been flipped politically. And you hear Republicans talk about the deep state. You hear them talk about tools of American foreign policy like the intelligence community, like NSA, in a negative way, whereas for many years, they could not give them enough money. And it feels like that issue politically has flipped in some way. Can you speak to any or all of that?
Sure. Thanks, first of all, for having me here. It's great to be here. I'm actually a Hoosier, so it's nice to be speaking on the stage. That's a big question, and maybe the best way for me to tackle it is to connect it to what Whit and Geoff have already said. Yep. That I think an enormous issue that perhaps explains some of this fluctuation in polling information is that global corruption has become a foreign policy issue. In other words, we heard Senator Young speak about the importance of public-private partnerships. I wholeheartedly endorse that, but the fact of the matter is that whenever you have a public-private partnership, you're protected by business proprietary. If it's a national security issue, you have a double web of secrecy with classification. And so we really have, over the years, trusted our elites to do the right thing behind closed doors. And that is probably not such a good idea. Oversight mechanisms are important. And we're seeing on both the left and the right, I think, a real expression of outrage that our elites are not working for us, the American people. They're lining their own pockets. They're serving themselves. And that's what got me interested in the topic of whistleblowers, because whistleblowers really are a way of keeping our elites honest. It's rooted in law. And until very recently, it was an authentic bipartisan issue. That's what's changed in the last couple of years, is there's been a complete flip where you have the president attacking his own intelligence community as being full of enemies who need to be rooted out. This is alarming to me, having studied the issue, because whistleblowing is as American as apple pie. We passed the world's first whistleblower protection law in 1778 during the American Revolution. And I could tell you stories. My book lays them out in great detail, hopefully in an interesting way. It's not an academic book. I cut hundreds of pages so it'd be readable. So you could tell me if you agree. I really, because I feel so importantly about this issue, this idea that there's a deep state that's fundamentally disloyal to the president and therefore to the United States is really a transformation, because our public servants swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And we haven't seen those sorts of attacks until recently.
What do you attribute that to? Is it, President Trump driving the train and Republican Party falling in line? Is it sort of the global landscape, the anti-elitist moment, populist moment, for lack of a more precise term, all of the above?
It's really all of the above, and I think a lot of people want to find the entity to blame, and it's really easy to say President Trump is to blame. But in a previous book that was mentioned, One Nation Under Contract, I wrote that about the privatization of American foreign policy. That was the increased use of private actors to serve government interests. And I think that's something that has had a lot of unintended consequences that people are really picking up on. That our public servants used to serve our country. It used to be seen as selling out if you went to the private sector and made a whole lot of money based on those contacts in government, and now it's seen as cashing in. It's seen as normal. Anybody who's lived in Washington, some of you can test
Looking
that.
across this panel.
Yeah.
A lot of Washingtonians
Over the
up here.
past
But seen by
two
whom? I
decades,
think the public still sees it as corrupt.
absolutely, but Washington has gotten rich over the last couple decades. So it's great for us. There are all these great restaurants, but Washington didn't used to be that sort of town, and I think that has something to do with it as well.
Yeah.
The demonization of the Foreign Service, though, is kind of very much a function of President Trump. That is,
I agree
I think,
on that.
just to be crystal clear about this, is that the Foreign Service played, and the intelligence services played a vital role as kind of representing, in sort of an enduring way, our national interest. And President Trump, I think, has a very what we learned over the past several years is that President Trump has a very clear sense of his own interests. And when those two things clash, what he has done is tried to demonize and delegitimize career servants. And I think that's to the very dangerous thing, and that we'll regret as a country.
Yeah, no, and just one small follow-up to that. I think you're absolutely right. And that ties to the whole theme of whistleblowing, because whistleblowing, since it is this long-standing tradition, is really not a partisan issue. It's an American issue, but he's turned it into a partisan issue with disastrous consequences.
And politically, I would argue fairly effectively with his base.
Yes.
When I'm on Fox News and this is an issue, I keep saying, look at me, do I look like the deep state? Do I look like someone who's trying to undermine you? But it's been quite effective. Bill, I want to come to you next. You were one of the moderators at the recent Democratic primary debate in South Carolina. You've been talking to these candidates. You talk to voters. I want to switch gears a tiny bit and talk a little bit about America's role in the world more broadly. 20 years after we went into Afghanistan, now the longest war in America's history, there's some increasing evidence that Americans want to focus inward. And whether you call that nationalist or not, there's just a sense that these candidates that you've been talking to are trying to grapple with what our role in the world should look like post-Afghanistan and now they're trying to be a post-Donald Trump president. I know that's a big question too, but how do you begin to unpack that?
I'd like to pick up with a little bit of what was just being discussed here, that I think the reason President Trump has been able to make hay with his argument is because the foundation, he found a ready audience because of the foundation that people were already skeptical and suspicious of the elites. Ever since the financial crisis and the endless wars, people just they're primed not to believe that the people who are running things are doing it in their favor, the people's favor, that they're primarily doing it in the elite's favor. So you have a president who comes in and sort of senses that and taps into that. There's a ready audience of people waiting there to say, yeah, I knew something was wrong, and he explains it to them in a way that connects. What I'm seeing with the candidates right now, I can't tell you what's going on. It's a mystery to me as well. But what I do know, I've covered 3 presidential campaigns from beginning to end, and 2 others I filled in when my colleagues had to take a break. So I've watched this unfold across the country, and I have tremendous faith in the American people. I really do. I'm not just saying that because it's what I'm supposed to say. I'm sitting up here. I really do. It's like people are concerned about their pocketbook issues. Of course they are. And I think since the financial crisis, the big cities and the East and West Coast are doing just fine, but people in the middle are not. And the reporters who are primarily based in the East and West Coast, they've not, until the last election, zeroed in on what's going on there. People who are comfortable living in their bubbles in the East and West Coast, they're not concerned about what's going on there. And Trump was the one who illuminated this and had everybody say, oh my God, we have a whole portion of the country that's not tied in with this globalization, with this high-tech expansion, with this gentrification. There's a whole section of the country that's not tapped into that. And I think all of the politicians this year, Democrats and Republicans, are trying to talk to Americans. They're trying to. And you have Bernie on one side who says that it's like, throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over with something new. And you've got the moderate Democrats saying, well, we can tinker with it and make this better. And they're all trying to tell Americans that their plan is the best. And I truly do not know. I truly don't. Somebody came up to me the other day and said, oh, Bernie can't win. I said, I can't say that. I really can't. If you had asked me, I would have said Barack Obama can't win. I really thought that until he won. You'd asked me 4 years ago, oh, Trump can't win until he won.
Right.
So I truly do not know who is going to tap that vein in the American electorate and win this time. But that's what's percolating there. That's what they've got to deal with.
A question for any or all who want to answer this, picking up on that, the issue of impeachment. How voters, how candidates on the Democratic side, how they're thinking about it, both politically, but also at root, it is a foreign policy issue. It is about the president using foreign aid, Democrats argue, for his own political personal gain. That's the Democratic argument that you hear from the candidates. How are voters pricing that issue in? Voters are not monolithic, I know that, but what are some trends you all are seeing? Anyone can start.
I think they are not pricing it in by and large. That they've kind of moved on to other things already, and it's not, except in a few Senate races, much more than in the House races, Susan Collins in particular. It's not really much of an issue. It's hard to believe that in a couple of months from now anybody's going to be running advertisements about impeachment one way or the other. But at the time of the vote on whether to remove or quit, a majority of Americans thought that President Trump was guilty of the conduct he was accused of in the first article of impeachment. That he did
The abuse of power article.
that he abused his power and used military assistance as leverage to achieve a personal political end. And people don't like that conduct. And there is a separate question of, I think people were much more ambivalent. Was it good or bad for America to have a president removed this close to an election? But people, I think, who paid attention, and again, that's not everybody who paid close attention to it, but the more attention you paid to the process, the more likely you were to feel that President Trump did something wrong that he shouldn't have done, that no president should do. And so, to the extent that there is anything lasting about the impeachment process, it is more that it sort of reinforces a view of President Trump with regard to his kind of ethical conduct or lack thereof. And at some point, I'd like to come back and talk about foreign policy, not just in terms of how you litigate specific issues, but how people see the character of the president.
Okay, I want Whit to see if he agrees with you, and then we'll come back to that.
Straight answer is yes. The simple political implication of impeachment, it made the red states and red districts redder and the blue states and blue districts bluer.
There you go. Go ahead, Allison.
Just chiming in on your first point, which is that impeachment is a foreign policy issue, but what you're telling us is the polling data doesn't show the sort of concern that the foreign policy establishment would have. But what's interesting to me is what was at stake in impeachment really was this whole issue of whether it's acceptable to have a shadow foreign policy that's run outside the official apparatus against the express wishes of the US Congress, who had appropriated the money. That obviously is enormously important for foreign policy, and we might be seeing a little bit of movement on that. I was impressed to see the Senate vote 55 to 45 to insist on congressional authorization for any use of force against Iran. So that's a little sign of Congress, a Republican-dominated Congress, trying to assert its foreign policy powers, which it rightfully has, according to the US Constitution.
But Bill, we've seen Republican and Democratic-led Congresses abdicate a lot of that foreign policy power to the executive, and now you see the political consequences where Democrats say, wait a second, when it's not Barack Obama in the White House, now we want to do a little more oversight.
Well, I think that's also what we were talking about before. I mean, there's a level of hypocrisy that is involved with the political process. I mean, when your party's in charge, well, the president's acting on our best interest. When your party's not in charge, he's breaking all the norms and all the laws. I mean, and in some cases that is true.
Right.
But when you scream that the sky is falling when the one guy is in office and you look the other way when your guy is in office, I think that plays into everybody who's not in Washington just shrugging their shoulders and saying, this is just a political game you guys are playing.
And I think it's indicative of the polarization across the board, across the country, not just on foreign policy issues. I used the example this week, when the Obama administration released a handful of Taliban prisoners in exchange for Bo Bergdahl, Republicans said the sky was falling, terrorists were going to all attack us. President Trump signs a peace agreement with the Taliban last week, and 5,000 Taliban prisoners are going back, and Republicans are like, this is great. This is ending the longest war in American history. Just look at that one issue for how party affiliation is driving policy preferences today.
Marie, on that one specifically,
That made my head kind of explode.
Not only have we not heard the last of that, we haven't really heard the first of that.
That's true.
This will get litigated. But I do just I want to point out that there is a lot of hypocrisy in the world, but it is not, when President Obama had to decide whether to bomb Syria, he decided at the last minute, you know what, Congress has to be involved. So it's not like both sides are exactly the same.
Oh, I'm truly not trying to say that there's an equivalence here. I think what's going on now is kind of unprecedented. So it's just that there has been enough on the other side that President Trump can point to the Democrats and say, oh, remember when they did that, and that plays well with his base.
That's true.
So let's talk a little bit, Jeff. You wanted to move the conversation towards this issue of leadership and judgment and how foreign policy is often a stand-in for those kinds of qualities in candidates.
Well, yes, and before I do that, just because character counts, let me just mention Chairman Hamilton, who I had the privilege of polling for when he was in Congress. And I looked at his last campaign, I think it was 1996. And I looked at the poll we did for him. And the number one reason that people in his congressional district wanted to reelect him is he was a man of integrity who Hoosiers could trust. And we just don't get that very much in polling anymore.
Do you even poll on that end anymore? Is that even an option?
About politicians, I think over just close to 70% of the voters in his district said that's one of the reasons why I want to reelect him. And in 1998, at the end of his term, among the voters in his district, 75% had a favorable opinion of him, which is also just the kind of number we don't see any longer. And it really is not just a testament to Chairman Hamilton, but to the good judgment of his constituents. But with regard to this question of presidential character, I do think, you mentioned the commander-in-chief test. I think President Trump has really raised that question in a slightly different way, which is, what we find in our polling is that people, approve of many of his policies, but worry very much about his characteristics as a foreign policy or national security leader. As part of the polling that we've conducted, we gave people a list of 18 different words and said, how well does each one describe President Trump as a national security or foreign policy leader? And the words that the people use most often or say are most accurate in describing him is that he is impulsive, risky, and at the at the very bottom, they say smart and effective. And but this, even when people, might have an inclination to agree with him, this notion of being impulsive is I think really formative. So has a material effect in the way people think about voters think about his reelection and the attributes they look for in a president. So when we had the situation with Soleimani in Iraq, and the impulsiveness was really the first frame that people went to in thinking about President Trump's conduct. And being smart and being strong are not exclusive to one another. But when we ask people about what's most important for a national security leader to be, smart or strong, by about 2 to 1, they say more important to be smart than strong.
There's no question.
Yeah, I was going to come to you. That's an interesting point.
There's no question that the character and the judgment of a president are absolutely critical in making decisions about them. But going back to one of the things Bill said, this anti-elite drive, this suspicion of the judgment of the people at the top is nothing new, and it's been building for half a century. We had the best and the brightest, in David Halberstam's phrase, that led us into Vietnam. It was a broad consensus that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I mean, you can go back and count, time after time after time where the elites were not right about what would happen. And so there is a well-justified suspicion of the judgment of a great many of the people at the top that is driving this whole populist movement, both in the Republican Party with Donald Trump and in the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders. And frankly, neither party has yet figured out how to deal with that populist movement.
And it's a populist movement that is not just happening here in the United States, but that is reflecting a broader global trend towards populism. Allison or Bill?
Well, I would argue that what's going on here, I mean, it really does, because we're the United States, it has, I was going to say a ripple effect. It's like a tsunami effect on the rest of the world. I remember when President Obama was given the Nobel Prize before he even took office. I mean, it was just right off the bat. And, whether you think it was, too soon or whatever, it showed how the world puts so much hope in the United States. Here's this young president coming up, and the world says, we want him to succeed. The world looks at us in that way. They want us to succeed. So when I hear, like the British foreign minister wondering whether they can trust us anymore, and the Germans and the French saying the same thing, it's beyond distressing. I mean, I'm not sure we have figured out what else, if not NATO, what else? If not our commitment to our friends and allies, what else? And I haven't heard that answer. I've seen the questions, and I see people questioning us, but where do we go from here?
Yeah, you hit on something important. We've talked a lot about how Americans see the world. You're talking about how the world sees America, and which voters probably don't often think about as much, but a lot of Democratic candidates this year are trying to impress upon voters why that actually matters, and we hear that from them.
Well, you've got what we were saying before. People are concerned about their pocketbook issues, and things like money you give to countries to help build a dam or to fight AIDS, that really has an impact. But when you have politicians who come in and pick that very small part of the budget and say, we're going to save so much money by cutting out foreign aid. Yeah. You might save a few bucks, but you have a really negative impact when you take your soft power off the table.
But making soft power tangible is really hard to do, Allison.
Absolutely. But Bill's right that foreign policy, our foreign policy affects the world in so many ways we don't. Let me phrase it this way. Foreign policy is all about long-term strategic thinking, and all the things we're talking about are in the moment. And if there aren't people to educate, if our leaders aren't educating the American people on the importance of this issue, the pocketbook issues will become worse. I start out by talking about global corruption. And that being a foreign policy issue. I think this ties in nicely to what you were speaking about, Bill, because you can't have anti-corruption initiatives around the world without the leadership of the United States. That was at stake in the whole Ukraine issue that led to impeachment. You can trace that through in a number of instances. I don't think people realize, and we need to realize, that our prosperity is tied to supporting the rule of law, or what I would call rule of law capitalism versus crony capitalism.
Yeah.
We will lose an enormous amount if people can't understand that.
Well, when you think
Well,
of
one thing that we didn't
ahead,
hear
Bill.
very much about, President Trump 3 weeks ago said, these anti-corruption laws are a big problem. We need to get rid of them.
Yeah, it's
And-
really.
I mean, it's really quite extraordinary that
when you think about Pax Americana, you know, the world since World War II, is the world that we created in our image. I mean, we talk about the Marshall Plan and all that. I mean, the Marshall Plan, of course, it helped Germany. Of course it did. But it helped us as well.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't truly, you know, it wasn't totally out of altruism. It was to have a stable, capitalist, democratic partner right in the center of Europe that was going to stabilize it and make it, you know, we've got our ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. It's not necessarily to keep, it's to keep the shipping lanes open so we can come and go and get the oil and send our ships to Japan and get the goods in China. I mean, we set the world up so that it worked for us, so that we could have billionaires who were running for president. I mean, they made their money based on the world that was set up after World War II.
Yeah.
And so to have our new president come in and not seem to understand that and start to, you know, criticize it and dismantle it without having anything to replace it, I think is problematic.
There's a reason why we haven't had World War III. And it's because some really smart people with great foresight set up a system, a world system like you're talking about, Bill. And we tend to take so many things for granted. It was not inevitable that we didn't have World War III. It was because some really good people, primarily American leaders, had the foresight to set up a world that avoided it. So I get a little frustrated sometimes with, let's just blow it up, and we'll figure out what comes from there. I'm sorry.
Yeah. One needs to ask what's next.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's almost a complete absence of any kind of strategic thinking in the current position of the White House.
But strategic thinking is in service of a purpose.
Right.
And it's not just the absence of strategic thinking, it's the absence of a clear definition of national purpose in the world.
Yes.
That what we have at stake in the world.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, in the post-World War II world, people really understood what we have at stake and whether we had a world at war or a world at peace. So they just lived, you know, and through the Cold War, it was, you know, abundantly clear what we had at stake. And it's not clear to many Americans any longer what are, you know, what is, we don't have a common definition, at least, of our national interest in the world.
We should at least be able to agree that our national interest is not the interests of the President of the United States.
Right.
Personal interests.
That's right. And when it comes to pocketbook issues, we haven't even touched on tariffs and trade wars because I'm going to go to audience questions now. But I remember sitting on stage last year with Senator Lugar, and he was talking about how it took them much longer last year to find customers for all of their soybeans. They eventually did, but that's a pocketbook issue. And this trade war, you know, we don't have time to get into all of that today unless someone asks about it in Q&A, but that is where foreign policy and strategic thinking hits pocketbooks for Hoosiers here and folks across the country. So,
by the way, I'm not so cynical.
Get your questions ready.
I do think the vast majority of interests of Americans believe that the interests of the president are not the same as the national interest.
Yeah, and I agree. And maybe our audience can explain it to me. Why, when you go out and speak around the country, as I've been doing on this book, you find so many like-minded people, and yet we can't seem to come together in the good Hamilton-Lugar tradition to act in the best interest of the United States.
Well, if anyone if anyone in the audience can answer that, we will all hire you, and you can come work for us.
Yes.
Please raise your hand. I think there are microphones somewhere. Are there microphones? Yes. Let's start with this woman right here. Are there microphones? Maybe you just have to shout. So, give it a go.
So my name is Caitlin Wishmeyer, and my question is: so for the first time in American history, we
So the question was, first president running for re-election after being impeached, and how you sort of being in uncharted territory, and how that is going to play out, we think.
I think I said what I believe already about impeachment. I think it made Republicans feel like Donald Trump was being persecuted, and Democrats believe that Donald Trump did something fundamentally wrong, and it just drove our partisan camps farther into their existing corners, but did not change very many minds about the president.
One addendum I will add to that, if in fact Vice President Biden is the nominee, I think you will see Republicans in the Senate and the House and President Trump focus on Hunter Biden's foreign work.
Corruption.
They will call it that.
Flip it, yeah.
Yes, they will try and flip it. And so this, like you said, Allison, this issue of foreign, quote, corruption, what that means, if in fact Vice President Biden is the nominee, I think that will be part of the Trump strategy. Okay, next questions. We do have microphones now. Great. Let's go right here to this gentleman. There is a mic coming to your right.
For a long time, we've seen foreign policy as...
Who are you?
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm James Romano. I'm a sophomore here at HLS studying international law and Chinese. So my question for the panelists today is, formerly, we have seen foreign policy as sort of like an issue of bureaucratic professionalism, but with the current actions of the Trump administration, do you think that this has made foreign policy more of a popular issue, or more of an issue that is has been enlightened by the news, and maybe will have more of an impact in this next election because of the past administration?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'd be interested in kind of directing the part of the question to Bill, because you talk about kind of the news. One of the challenge is that, you know, relative to when I was in school, the news environment is totally different. There is sort of, you know, you had sources that kind of left you with a coherent set of facts about the world. And now the news environment is incredibly fragmented. The way people follow the news has changed. And kind of what they know and don't know is episodic. The level of, I mean, I don't know what it is at CBS. The level of investment in foreign news coverage, I think, is down considerably. So again, I think in fairness to the public, they kind of, you know, they can react to things that they're informed about and educated about. And, but, you know, the ability of kind of news to do that, I think, is changing. And I don't know where you see just kind of foreign coverage as, you know, in the hierarchy of priorities and kind of in kind of the major news organizations.
You're right. There's a balkanization of news delivery. Today, you can get it anytime, any place, anywhere. You know, too many people, I think, are getting it off of Facebook and Twitter. My real concern is that it's bite-sized. You can just sort of, you know, grab a handful of news and think you're informed. The real news is, you know, it's available. You know, it's just not the way it was delivered when I was growing up. I don't know about the rest of you, but I think so. There were, at the time, you guys will not believe this, but there were like 3 networks. And the news came on, that was it.
Yeah.
And the news came on at 6:30. In my house, it was like church. The kids had to be quiet. My father, you know, came in from work, took a shower, sat down and watched the news.
Yeah.
And it was serious business. And the news was serious. The news at the time was serious. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, it was, I mean, it was serious. Now, there's serious stuff going on out there, but you don't have to sit down at 6:30 and the whole country watch it together. You can watch whatever you want, whenever you want. You can not pay attention to it if you don't want to. And I think that contributes to this whole scenario that we're talking about here. There's no common discussion. There's no common place where we all know the same information and we're all dealing with the same information, and that's how we make a decision. You're getting conspiracy theories You know, and lots of people believe that there's a sex ring in the basement of the Capitol. I mean, it's just, it's nuts. But a lot of people believe this stuff. And I'm not sure. What I come down to is like it's incumbent upon you. And it really is. The information's out there. You have to work a little harder today to get it because it's not being spoon-fed to you. It's being dumped on you. And you have to sort of go look and find the places that are giving you news that, you know, do a little historical look at it. Was it true 10 years ago? Were they telling you the truth about the financial crisis? Well, maybe they're telling you the truth about climate change. You can find sources that are putting facts out there, but you have to do the work.
Yeah, can I just jump on that quickly as a
Of course.
professor?
Yes.
This is something I notice in the classroom as well, is that students don't have the same sort of historical knowledge to be able to compare what's going on in this country to other countries. They don't have, for a variety of reasons, an understanding of how American constitutional democracy is supposed to operate. And these are all things that good professors should be filling in, but we can also be teaching students how to distinguish fact from fiction.
Yeah.
It's not as difficult as is often presented. I mean, I'll give you just one tip. You should always never trust a headline. You need to read the article because what you'll find a majority of the time is that's designed to grab your attention, inflame your emotions, but when you actually read what's said, it doesn't capture what's being said in the news article. So that would be my first
That's a good tip.
suggestion to everybody out there.
A woman standing, yes, right there in the suit.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I study music, computer science, and Chinese language.
That's
My
a
question
combination.
is, has the American people's stake in war decreased in the last century? And if so, has that affected Americans' willingness for our government to take military action?
It's a great question. You've stumped the panel.
Yeah.
No, I know. I think you've asked an extremely important question. It's actually, for me, a point of optimism in the midst of all this doom and gloom, because I think when you have this sort of electorate, well, let me phrase that a bit. A leader can really skew things in the wrong way with highly nationalist thinking, but you do get people less and less willing to endorse long-term foreign engagements like we've seen over the past 2 decades. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The American people can be a great restraint on the behavior of elites. And this might be one realm where we could be optimistic.
Where we see that. Whit, do you see that in the polling? Are Americans war weary? Even though a very small percentage of Americans right now, certainly compared to Vietnam or World War II, are actually fighting in these wars?
Oh, sure. And President Trump has tapped into that war weariness. The question then becomes, but what next?
Right.
We don't just withdraw from everywhere.
Right.
That'll make the situation worse. As our client Marco Rubio is fond of saying, the world is a better and safer place when America plays a leading role in it. So the question is, what is the answer to that? And I don't know that we have a good answer yet, but yes, there is definitely frustration with what the president has termed endless wars.
Yeah. Yes, right here in the front, our wonderful introducer.
Thank you very much. Once again, Tyler Combs, Senior Political Science and Russian East European Studies. So there's been a lot of talk in this panel about elites and about the backlash against elites. And Dr. Ayres and Dr. Stanger gave wonderful examples of times when elites have made mistakes, and the American people have been very upset with that. And so in that context, in this context of this call to throw the bums out and whatnot, over the past few decades, have the American people been sufficiently included in the foreign policy making process? And if so, and if not, how can that change for the future?
That's a great question.
Yeah,
One thing it helps to remember about the difference between foreign policy and domestic policy is that on domestic policy issues like abortion, like Medicare for all that would eliminate private health insurance, a lot of Americans have thought a lot about these issues and have pretty firm opinions about them. In foreign policy, it's not the case at all. I mean, what should we do about threats to the independence of Hong Kong? Is the Iran nuclear deal a good idea or not? Most Americans don't know that much about it and don't have particularly firm opinions about it. What that means is that there's wide latitude for experts and people who are knowledgeable to make policy and persuade the public that that is the right direction to go. That's actually good news for graduates of the Hamilton Luger School, because it means that there's far more latitude for you to affect not only what happens, but what the public thinks about what happens in foreign policy than there ever is in domestic policy.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's a really great question. And I agree with you that there's a bright future for you. We need you and your input. But if you look at the history of whistleblowing in the United States and how the American people have reacted to abuses of power, and you view it from kind of 30,000 feet, it's an optimistic history. Because what you see is that Congress can legislate in response to abuses of power and put in place measures that they hope will prevent them from happening again. And one example of that is the whole intelligence community inspector general system, which is a response to Watergate. You also have the War Powers Act as a response to Watergate. There's no reason we can't respond to this current moment when the dust settles, reflect on what we've learned from it, and hopefully legislate accordingly. So that's your job.
We have time for one more question. Yes, this woman right up front.
Hi, my name is Devlin Cook-Hines. I'm a junior here, double majoring in international studies and Russian, and I'm also in the Russian flagship. So a few of you have talked about concerns arising in the news industry. I wanted to specifically ask about fake news as a concept, really coming into the American vernacular in the 2016 election, how you see that playing a part in this current election cycle, and perhaps fake news coming from abroad and influences from abroad in the election, particularly Russia, because Russian major. Thank you so much.
Sounds like a Bill question.
Boy, I am, really.
Go ahead.
I am so impressed with these students.
You're
My
the best.
gosh.
I'm going to clap for that.
I can barely speak English. It's a real problem. It's a real problem, and it's a real issue. Again, I mean, I'm going to fall back on what I said before. You know, it is incumbent upon you to seek out the truth. The truth is available, but it's not as easy picking as the fake stuff. And I did a story about the Russian hacking of our election system. I did 2 of them, and it's for real. I mean, what happened in 2016 is happening again. And we have very few tools to prevent it. I think the best tool is your brain and your suspicions and skepticism. You know, if something seems ridiculous, it probably is. Although nowadays, even the real seems ridiculous. But
The whole world is the
but there is Russian influence, and it's, you know, the social media folks are saying that they're trying to keep an eye out for it and they're trying to stop it, and, you know, but they've got other ways to get in and get around. They can bounce it off of a server in Arizona and come in from another way. I mean, they're at work. And an even greater fear is the trying to tap into our election systems directly, or hacking into the Republican and Democratic committees. I mean, it's a real fear, and we all have to be on alert. And I wish I could say there's a real good fix for this, but I think the fix is you.
You know, one, it's not a fix. But it would be much better if we had a president of the United States who takes this threat seriously, who does not, you know, tell Americans or through his body language and through his words that they don't need to take it seriously, and who are willing, you know, to take actions to protect the security of our elections and to confront countries that are interfering in our elections.
One of the things I would, yeah. That's good. And just to build on that, one of the things I would encourage students to look at as you think about the future of American foreign policy is the extent to which this changed balance of power between the private sector on the one hand and government on the other hand has to figure into our foreign policy frameworks. So companies like Facebook and Google, if you watch them, they have the functional equivalents of foreign policies now. They're
Yes,
almost
they do.
adopting, parallel judicial structures, and that has to enter into strategic thinking about the American national interest. It's an exciting new thing to think about.
Yes. And I will end this panel by saying, in addition to evaluating the news for yourself, you all need to vote. I don't care who you vote for, but you all have to vote. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for coming.